My name is Lauren Yeomans, and I'm Principal Flute of the Etobicoke Philharmonic Orchestra. In anticipation of our upcoming concert, Jubilations of Spring, I'm doing a deep dive into Robert Schumann's First Symphony, the Spring Symphony, as part of our new series, Listen and Learn with Lauren. Come along for the journey! Robert Schumann was a German composer from Saxony, born into a family with no musical connection, although his father was a bookseller, writer, and publisher. Robert himself was a very talented writer and even went to school to study the law, but ultimately abandoned that path as he aspired to a career as a concert pianist, moving into the house of his piano teacher and future father-in-law, Friedrich Wieck. Unfortunately, Robert's piano dreams would not come into fruition as he permanently damaged his hand with a dubious medical device intended to stretch the span of his hand so he could reach a greater range of notes on the piano. Crushed by this development, Robert found his passion again in composition, as well as music criticism, co-founding the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, or New Journal of Music, in 1834. Robert wasn't initially interested in Friedrich's daughter, Clara Wieck, as she was quite young when they met, but as she grew into adolescence and then adulthood, the two developed an affection for one another which blossomed into a timeless romance. Trained from an early age to be a child prodigy going on to be an international concert pianist and composer, Clara was infinitely more famous than her husband, with poets writing poems about her, fancy desserts being named after her, and police being brought into her performances to deal with crowd control. When Friedrich found out about the romance between Robert and Clara in 1835, he told Robert all connection with their household was over and took Clara on an extended tour to separate the two, which devastated both of them. By 1837, a mutual friend began exchanging letters between Robert and Clara, with the couple deciding eventually to marry. When Clara asked her father to bless this wedding, he refused, and they subsequently spent the next few years in a legal battle with Friedrich so that they could finally get married, which they finally achieved on September 12, 1840. It was in this year, 1840, that Robert, who had previously only written music for the piano, wrote a great amount of Lieder, or German art song, inspired by his love for Clara. It was in the wake of this happiness that the Spring Symphony, as well as their first child, was born. Clara had long petitioned for Robert to write for the orchestra, writing, "His imagination cannot find sufficient scope on the piano. His compositions are all orchestral in feeling." This may have been partially influenced by the fact that her father had been very vocal in suggesting that Robert would not be able to provide for the couple, and Clara had felt that if Robert was writing for the symphony, as opposed to the small piano works he was known for, he would earn the respect and esteem of her father, creating a path for them to reconcile. Robert had first attempted to write a symphony in 1832, but quickly abandoned the effort after realizing it would require a better understanding of orchestration. His interest in returning to the genre began in 1839 upon discovering the manuscript to Franz Schubert's great C major symphony through Schubert's brother Ferdinand, which at that point had yet to be performed. Schumann advocated for the work to his friend Felix Mendelssohn, who was then the director of the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra, to finally premiere it. After the performance, Schumann wrote in a review, "Composers have so often been advised to their chagrin that it is better for them, after Beethoven, to abstain from the symphonic form. On hearing Schubert's symphony and its bright, flowery, romantic life, the city crystallizes before me, and I realize how such work could be born in these very surroundings. This symphony reveals to us something more than mere beautiful song, mere joy and sorrow, such as music has ever expressed in 100 ways, leading us into regions that to our best recollection we had never before explored." It wasn't until January of 1841 that he started to work on a symphony in C minor. However, once he had the idea for the Spring Symphony, he abandoned this material, later revisiting it for his Fourth Symphony in 1851. Robert was inspired to write the Spring Symphony when he attended a Bach concert with Mendelssohn performing on January 21st of 1841, which included parts of Bach's B minor Mass, as well as the chaconne from the second violin partita. The symphony was sketched in only 4 days between January 23rd and January 26th, 1841, with the full orchestration completed within the next month. It was written in the winter with a character of longing and excitement for the spring to come, which he described as the vernal passion that sways men until they are very old and which surprises them with each year, something that all Canadians can certainly relate to. Initially, Robert gave titles to the individual movements, but later decided to remove them as he wanted the symphony to be evaluated for its music rather than its depictions. However, I will be including them as I find it shines a light on the composer's perspective. The The Spring Symphony was premiered in March of 1841 by the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra, once again conducted by Schumann's friend Felix Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn was thrilled with the new composition and made a point of meeting with Schumann twice to go over some impracticalities in the score. This symphony was in fact the first completed work Schumann ever wrote for instruments other than the piano or the voice, which is quite an ambitious undertaking, as composers will at least try to write some chamber music or a string quartet to get an idea of how the instruments in the orchestra work before jumping into a full symphony. So all the things considered, he did an okay job of it. But Schumann has a somewhat notorious reputation for not being great at orchestration, which is not entirely unfounded. Don't get me wrong, Clara was right in expressing that he has a gift for imagining the scope of the symphony, which is certainly thrilling for the audience, but it demands a level of virtuosity from the players to achieve in a way that can be somewhat stressful. He also occasionally throws in some pianistic effects that would work great on the piano, but are often jolting or kind of meaningless in the context of a full orchestra. As I said, this isn't a limitation on the artistic imagination, more a reflection that if he had lived a little longer and understood the instruments he wrote for a little more, he might have written works that lionized him as one of the great symphonists, rather than one who was brilliant but deeply flawed. For now, let's go on to the brilliance. The Spring Symphony's first movement, titled The Beginning of Spring, opens with a brass call in the trumpets and horns, similar to the horn call opening of Schubert's Ninth Symphony, which Schumann describes as a summons to awakening. The rhythm of this call replicates the final words of a poem by Adolf Buttger, Im Tale blüht der Frühling auf, or In the darkness of the valley, spring blooms forth. Schumann originally had this call a few pitches down from where it's left today, but he didn't realize that the notes on the natural horns in this orchestra that didn't have valves to adjust the notes could only be played by being stopped, which is when horn players have to put their hand in their bell to adjust the pitch. The result of this stopping is that instead of an opening oh sound, it created a more muted eh sound, which caused a bit of embarrassment at the first rehearsal, leading Schumann to move the pitch to what would sound more open on the horns. In regards to the remainder of the slow introduction, Schumann said, I should like the music to suggest the world's turning green, perhaps with a butterfly hovering in the air, which he depicts gracefully with the woodwinds. Butterflies, or as Schumann used the French papillon, being very important imagery to the composer. This first statement ends up being important throughout the full symphony, and Schumann cohesively uses as much the material in the introduction throughout the symphony. This eventually leads to a quickening pace, poco a poco or little by little, a technique which Schumann was known for using in his piano works, until he reached the faster tempo of the allegro section. Schumann describes this exuberant section, shows how everything to do with spring is coming to life, which he contrasts with the lyrical second theme in the clarinet. This first movement of the symphony has one of the first uses of a triangle in the orchestral literature after Haydn's 100th Symphony, the Military Symphony, and accompanying the famous tenor solo in the last movement of Beethoven 9. Fra, wie seine Sonnen fliegen. The famous triangle was added to the symphony as a way of replicating Turkish military bands, which Schumann uses to charming effect. This is also one of the first orchestral works to require 3 timpani rather than the previous standard 2 at the suggestion of his cousin-in-law, Ernst Punt. Something particularly innovative in this movement is in the recapitulation or repeated section of this movement. In the symphony of the classical era, typically you would have a slow introduction followed by an exposition, a development section which played with and modified the material from the exposition, and then the recapitulation would repeat the material from the exposition. However, in this symphony, Schumann also repeats material from the slow introduction, which he translates into longer notes within the faster tempo. After the recapitulation, there's a coda to wrap everything up, but Schumann innovates here again by introducing new material with a chorale played, first by the strings and then the winds. I suspect he picked up this idea from Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, a piece he greatly admired and wrote a glowing review 6 years previous, which also ends the first movement with a chorale, although in that piece the chorale is more solemn, whereas in the Spring Symphony is more a passionate declaration of joy. Schumann was notorious for his exquisite slow movements, and the second movement of this symphony, titled Evening, is no exception. It is a deeply moving and passionate tribute to his darling wife Clara, with a sumptuous, languid melody that seems to float effortlessly above space and time. This movement displays Schumann as the lyrical heir to Schubert, with Beethovenian textures lying beneath, particularly reminiscent of the slow movements of his second and sixth symphonies. Funnily enough, it too ends with a chorale, this time with the trombones, who haven't played for the rest of the movement, in a slow and solemn version of the melody that's to come in the third movement scherzo. The third movement is a scherzo titled Merry Playmates, and is a gutsy, rustic romp evoking the imagery of a country dance. Here Schumann innovates again, as most scherzos have a singular contrasting trio section, typically pastoral in nature, but this symphony has 2 trios, alternating with the scherzo theme and eventually culminating in a slower, more sentimental version of the material, drifting off into fragments. The fourth movement, titled Spring in Bloom, begins with a flourish similar to the opening of the first movement. However, it leads to a happier major statement, leading to a melody that is bright and sprightly. He contrasts this with a second melody taken from an earlier piano work of his called Chrysleriana, but this melody is repeatedly interrupted with the material from the first melody, now in a minor key. Bum 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 ba-da-dum. It has been suggested that this is a miniature version of the baritone's interjection from Beethoven 9, the O Freunde, nicht diese Tone, or O friends, not these sounds, but let us sing more pleasantly and more joyful ones, with the idea that Schumann is shooing away the smaller piano works of his past for the grand symphony. Melodies lead to a development section, which leads to the music coming to a dramatic halt. The horn section plays a series of rising thirds culminating in a solo flute cadenza that eventually leads us back to the main melody with the bassoon. Originally, this cadenza was written to be at the beginning, but Schumann moved it during the orchestration process to the middle of the movement, a jarring effect reminiscent of the oboe cadenza in the first movement of Beethoven 5. So why do we listen to this symphony? For one, it's jaunty and very fun. It was one of the most popular works that Schumann wrote in his lifetime, getting over 50 performances within 10 years of its premiere. For my money, I'd say that the main reason to listen to Schumann is to experience the profound divinity of his slow movements, but there's a certain something in it for everyone. As for Schumann as a symphonist, what we get from Schumann is a path from the classical era of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven to the late Romantic era, with Brahms and Tchaikovsky being particularly inspired by the composer. Schumann took the standard structure of the symphony and added these episodic interjections, allowing composers to find new methods for expression. Tchaikovsky, who used to repeatedly play piano transcriptions of Schumann's orchestral work in the 1860s, said of him, "Schumann's greatness lies, on the one hand, in his wealth of emotion, on the other, in the depth of his spiritual experience and his striking originality." In listening to his work, we allow ourselves this opportunity to be similarly inspired. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please join the Etobicoke Philharmonic on Friday, May 9th at 8 p.m. at Martin Grove Collegiate to see this symphony, as well as Johann Strauss's Overture from Die Fledermaus, Alice Ho's Jubilations of Spring, where the name of this concert comes from, and a selection of arias sung by soprano Natalia Gennady. We will also be doing a shorter matinee performance on Saturday, May 10th at 2 p.m. at the Humber Cultural Hub Recital Hall, with the full program minus the arias. Ticket information available in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to this channel and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. See you in the concert hall!